On the morning of September 4th, 1893, a group of neighbors pulled hay away from a wall inside Paul Halliday's barn. They were looking for the farmer himself. He had been missing for several days from his property in Burlingame, in the town of Mamakating, Sullivan County, New York. His young wife, Lizzie, had told them he had gone to Bloomingburg to do masonry work. The men did not believe her. One of them was Halliday's own son, Robert. The others were neighbors who had grown suspicious over the preceding days. They went to the justice of the peace and obtained a search warrant, and when they began to search the house, they found a piece of carpet freshly stained with blood, a spent cartridge from a revolver, and a piece of blood-stained rope. Lizzie turned violent and struck one of the men on the head with a board. The men calmed her and persuaded her to take Robert Halliday to Bloomingburg to prove that Paul was alive. While they were gone, the rest of the search party continued in the barn. They found a large pile of hay that had been recently heaped against one wall, and they began digging through it, expecting to find the body of Paul Halliday. What they found instead were the bodies of two women. One was middle-aged, the other was younger. Both had been shot many times, and both were badly decomposed. Their hands had been tied across their chests, and their feet and knees had been bound with ropes. Lizzie Halliday was brought back to the farm, and an inquest was held on the two bodies. She would not sit still for it. She tore at her clothes. She made remarks that had nothing to do with the questions put to her. She ignored what the coroner asked. According to the reports, she behaved as though she did not understand that she was being questioned at all. The inquest was inconclusive. She was held as a witness. The neighbors in Mamakating had not been surprised that something had happened at the Halliday farm. They had been afraid of Lizzie for nearly 2 years. She was a short, stout woman with reddish hair and a pointed nose, and the press of the time made much of her dark blue eyes under heavy brows. She was known to wander the woods at night. The neighbors believed she was a gypsy, and they kept their distance. When the house had burned the first time, they had suspected her. When the barn had burned, they had suspected her again. When Paul Halliday's horses had disappeared, they had been certain. The New York Herald, writing that September, put the question that the country would argue about for the next year. Hers was a remarkable career, the paper wrote, showing that she possessed either a wonderful aptitude for crime or a strangely disturbed mind. Perhaps both of these endowments were hers. It was the first formulation of a problem that no institution would ever solve. The next day, the bodies were identified. They were Margaret McQuillan and her daughter, Sarah Jane McQuillan. The McQuillans were not strangers to Sullivan County by geography, but they were not locals either. They had run a saloon at 1218 North Front Street in Philadelphia. According to the New York Herald, they had been hired by the Hallidays and had traveled north to the farm in the Catskills. They had also been more than employers of Maggie Hopkins 5 years earlier. In the winter of 1888, a woman calling herself Maggie Hopkins had arrived in Philadelphia and had taken shelter at the McQuillan saloon. She had grown up knowing the family in Ireland, where they had been neighbors to the McNallys in County Antrim. She had stayed with them. She had opened a small shop nearby with their knowledge. The woman who called herself Maggie Hopkins was Lizzie. Margaret and Sarah McQuillan had sheltered her in 1888. 5 years later, they had come to her at Paul Halliday's farm, and they had been shot, bound, and buried under hay. The reports of the time do not explain why the McQuillans agreed to travel to Sullivan County in August of 1893. They do not explain what was said in the letters, if there were letters. They do not explain what the McQuillans thought they were coming to. They explain only that the women who had once taken Lizzie in were the women who were found under the hay. The search continued for several days. The men were still looking for Paul Halliday. They found 2 pistols of .38 caliber on the property. Then they turned to the floor of the kitchen inside the house. Under the floorboards, they found the body of the man they had been looking for since the beginning. Paul Halliday had a fractured skull. He had 3 gunshot wounds to the chest. His body had been bound in the same way as the McQuillans, with the hands crossed and the feet and knees tied. He was, the Herald reported on September 8th, bullet-riddled and mutilated. He had never gone to Bloomingburg. He had never left the house. While Lizzie had told the neighbors that her husband was away doing masonry work, and while she had agreed to take his son to meet him, her husband had been lying under the kitchen floor. The hay in the barn had been piled recently. The boards in the kitchen had been loosened and replaced. Paul Halliday had been missing for a specific number of days, and the story about Bloomingburg had been prepared in advance. 3 people had been murdered on the farm. The infrastructure to hide all 3 had been in place. On June 19, 1894, the day the trial opened in Monticello, the New York Times laid out for its readers what it had learned about the prisoner's life before she had come to Sullivan County. She had been born Eliza Margaret McNally around 1859 in County Antrim, Ireland. Her family had come to the United States when she was a small child. She had been married, the Times reported, 6 times. Her first husband was a man in Greenwich, New York, known by the name Charles Hopkins. His real name, it would later be reported, was Ketzpool Brown. They had married in 1879. He had died in 1881. Her second husband was Artemus Brewer, a Civil War veteran and a pensioner. They had married in 1881. He had died less than a year after the wedding. Her next venture, the Times wrote, was Hiram Parkinson, who deserted her within a year. She then married, Parkinson being still alive, George Smith, a veteran and a comrade of her second husband Brewer. In a few months, she tried to kill Smith by giving him a cup of poisoned tea. Failing in her design, she fled to Bellows Falls, VT, taking with her every portable article in the house. In Bellows Falls, she had married a Vermont resident named Charles Plaisdell. 2 weeks after the wedding, she had vanished. On the husbands who had died, the New York Times offered one of the more restrained observations of the entire case. Whether these men died natural deaths or were murdered, it wrote, is not known. That was the record the Times set out in 1894. The winter after she left Vermont belonged, apparently, to the McQuillans. She resurfaced in Philadelphia in the winter of 1888, calling herself Maggie Hopkins. She stayed with the McQuillan family at the saloon on 1218 North Front Street. The McQuillans had known the McNallys in Ireland, and they appear to have taken her in on that account. She opened a small shop nearby. Shortly afterward, the shop burned. She was arrested for arson and convicted of setting the fire to collect the insurance, and she was sentenced to 2 years at the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. She served her sentence. When she was released, she moved north. At some point, she appeared in Newburgh, in Orange County, New York, where she met Paul Halliday. He was a widower living with his sons on a farm in Burlingame, about 40 miles inland. He hired her as a housekeeper. She called herself Lizzie Brown. He was at least 40 years older than she was. They married in 1890, 5 years after the fire in Philadelphia. In August of 1893, Margaret McQuillan and her daughter Sarah traveled from Philadelphia to the Halliday farm. Press accounts said they had been hired. The accounts do not say who wrote to them, or what the letter said, or what the women understood about the work they were coming to do. It is known only that the family that had once sheltered Maggie Hopkins sent 2 of its members to the house she now shared with Paul Halliday. The farm in Burlingame had been burning, on and off, for nearly 2 years before the McQuillans arrived. Within 2 years of the marriage, the main house caught fire. Paul Halliday's intellectually disabled son, John, died in the blaze. Neighbors believed that Lizzie had set the fire to kill him, or had killed him and set the fire to hide what she had done. According to one account, the door of John's bedroom was found locked in the rubble, and Lizzie was in possession of the key. She was arrested. The evidence was not enough to hold her. Soon afterward, she stole Paul Halliday's team of working horses, drove them with the help of another man to Newburgh, and sold them. She was arrested a second time. This time, she pleaded insanity, and she was committed to the Middletown Asylum. The transfer from Middletown to the Auburn Asylum became violent. She smashed the windows of the omnibus and attacked the sheriff escorting her. She was transferred on to the Matawan Asylum. The horse theft case was dismissed, and after some months the doctors declared her cured. Paul Halliday came and took her home. Neighbors told reporters later that the old man had been warned. He had, by one account, called himself no fool like an old fool. That phrase appears in a late retelling and not in the papers of the period, and it is best taken as local memory rather than as a recorded quotation. What is documented is simpler. By the summer of 1893, institutions in New York State had already examined Lizzie 3 times. A prosecutor had declined to hold her for arson. A court had declined to hold her for horse theft. 3 asylums had declared her cured. Each decision had been made separately. None of them had been made with the others in mind. Lizzie Halliday was taken to the Sullivan County Jail in Monticello. She would live there for 9 months until her trial the following June. The first thing she did was refuse to eat. The jail physician was obliged to force liquid food through her nostrils. In November, she tried to strangle the sheriff's wife. A few days later, she set fire to her bedclothes. In December, she tried to hang herself with the binding torn from the bottom of her dress. On December 15th, she broke glass from the window of her cell and gashed her throat and her arms. Afterward, according to the press, she was asked why. "I thought I would cut myself," she said, "to see if I would bleed." By the spring, she was being kept chained to the floor. For the last 3 months, the New York Times wrote in June of 1894, "It has been necessary to keep her chained to the floor." During those same months, the case moved outward. The New York Herald sent reporters. The New York World sent Nellie Bly, who was known for having spent 10 days in a women's asylum on Blackwell's Island 6 years earlier. Bly made 2 trips to Monticello. She managed to interview Lizzie, and she was able to confirm the earlier marriages, which reporters had suspected but had not verified. The story moved onto the front pages of papers across the country. Inside the cell, the jail physician kept a prisoner alive through her own nostrils, restrained her, treated her throat after she cut it, and prepared her for the courtroom the following June. The cell had become the province of 2 institutions at once: the sheriff's custody and the medical profession's observation. They did not agree about what they were looking at. The Herald had already said so in September. The disagreement did not go away. It simply moved into the jail with her. In December, the sheriff of Sullivan County gave the country a new theory. Sheriff Harrison Beecher told reporters that his investigations had linked Mrs. Halliday to the Whitechapel murders in London. "Recent investigations," he said, "show that Mrs. Halliday is in all probability connected with the famous Whitechapel murders. It has been proved that she was in Europe at the time. She frequently refers to the subject, both when she is in possession of her mental faculties and when she is raving. Mrs. Halliday is constantly speaking of these murders." The statement appeared in the New York Herald and was picked up by the Kalamazoo Gazette on December 3rd and by the Middletown Daily Times on December 4th. Beecher also described a conversation he had had with his prisoner. "I said to Mrs. Halliday, 'Lizzie, you are accused of the Whitechapel murders. Are you guilty?' The reply he gave the papers was one of the few remarks of hers anyone recorded during the entire jail year. "Do you think I am an elephant?" she replied. That was done by a man. The sheriff's theory did not survive long. No evidence had placed her in Europe. She had been in the United States, in Vermont and Philadelphia and New York, through the autumn of 1888, when the Whitechapel killings were committed. No police force on either side of the Atlantic ever connected her to the London murders. The theory had originated with Sheriff Beecher in his jail in Monticello, and it had traveled, and it had been printed, and that had been enough. The trial opened on June 17, 1894, before Judge Edwards at the Sullivan County Oyer and Terminer Court in Monticello. Crowds came from across New York State. Some of them brought children. Judge Edwards was obliged to remind the courtroom that it was not a place of amusement. The evidence against Lizzie was circumstantial but strong. Her attorney did little to challenge it, having decided to rest the case on the plea of insanity. The defense called several doctors from the asylums where she had been held before 1893. They testified that she was insane. The prosecution called its own medical witnesses, who testified that she was not. The jury took the prosecution's view. On June 21, 1894, it convicted Lizzie Halliday of the first-degree murder of Margaret McQuillan and Sarah Jane McQuillan. She was sentenced to die in the electric chair, which had been introduced in New York State 4 years earlier. Her execution was scheduled for August 6th. She would be the first woman in the United States to die by electrocution. She did not die by electrocution. In July, Governor Roswell P. Flower appointed a medical commission to review her sanity. The commission examined her and declared her insane. On its recommendation, the governor commuted her sentence to life in a psychiatric institution. She was transferred to the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane in Fishkill. In the span of about 3 weeks, 3 institutions had reached 3 different conclusions about the same woman. The jury had found her sane enough to be put to death. The governor's commission had found her insane. The new institution receiving her would be obliged to decide for itself. It was also the same class of institution that had, twice before, declared her cured and let her go. Matawan was difficult with her. She tried to kill herself. She tried to escape. She attacked attendants. Newspapers of the period carried short notices of the trouble. Then she settled. In 1898, the Kalamazoo Gazette reported on a production put on by the inmates of the Matawan Asylum. It was described as an exciting war play, produced and performed by the insane. Lizzie Halliday was among the performers. The paper gave no indication that her part had been anything other than ordinary. Over the following years, she came to be regarded as one of the most trusted patients in the hospital. She was given sewing privileges, which, in the practice of the institution, meant access to needles and scissors. Her good conduct was attributed, in the accounts of the hospital, to her affection for one of the young nurses, Nellie Wicks. Lizzie had grown attached to her over the course of years. In 1906, Nellie Wicks decided to leave Matawan. She planned to work as a private nurse outside the hospital. Lizzie, hearing of this, told someone on the staff that if Nellie Wicks tried to leave, she would kill her. The threat was noted. It was not treated as serious. The attachment was known, and the nurse had nursed her for more than a decade without incident. The sewing privileges were not revoked. For 12 years, the institutional answer to Lizzie Halliday had held. She had been placed in an asylum. She had improved. She had taken part in a play. She had been trusted with scissors. On September 27, 1906, Nellie Wicks walked into a lavatory at Matawan, and Lizzie followed her in and locked the door. She had a pair of scissors. She used them. When the door was opened, Nellie Wicks was still alive. She died about 2 hours later. The next day, the Boston Herald ran the headline, "Insane Woman Kills Nurse She Loved." The Logansport Pharos of Indiana, about 3 weeks later, offered another version. Murder by a maniac. Lizzie Halliday, ex-gypsy, adds a 7th victim to her list. There was no new trial. She was already serving a life sentence. She was moved to more secure custody within the same institution. The scissors had been in the building since she arrived. Lizzie Halliday died at the Matawan State Hospital on June 28, 1918. The immediate cause of death was Bright's disease, a kidney condition common in the period. She had been in the asylum for nearly 24 years. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the hospital grounds. The New York Times, running its obituary the next day, described her as the woman guilty of 5 murders and described as worst woman on earth. Other papers gave different counts. There had been 3 victims at the farm. 4, if the count included John Halliday, the stepson who had died in the fire of 1891. 5, if the count included Nellie Wicks. 6, if it included any of the 2 husbands who had died within a year of marriage. 7, which was the figure the Logansport Pharos had used in 1906, allowing also for the man Lizzie had once told Robert Halliday she had killed in Belfast. None of the husbands were exhumed. No independent evidence confirmed or disproved the Belfast confession. No record explains why Margaret and Sarah McQuillan agreed to travel from Philadelphia in August of 1893, or what they were told when they arrived, or why they were shot rather than sent home. On the question of the dead husbands, the New York Times had offered in June of 1894 a sentence that did as much as the record allows. Whether these men died natural deaths or were murdered, the paper had written, is not known. It was not known then. It is not known now. I'd really appreciate you describing it in just 2 words in the comments. Thanks.